3 miles through the dark in a Montana blizzard, a crippled girl from Boston dragged a 230-pound man down a mountain on a travois she had built with her own hands. Her bad leg failed her 8 times. She got back up 9. 6 hours earlier, the whole town of Silver Creek had laughed at her. 6 weeks earlier, she had been thrown out of a Boston house with $3.40 to her name. How did she end up on a mountain at 9,000 feet, saving the life of a man who just 90 days before was a stranger, settle, and friend? This one is going to take you somewhere. The girl stood in the mud of the main square of Silver Creek, Montana territory, and the whole town was laughing at her. Snow was falling, not the gentle kind that softens the world, but the first hard bite of a mountain winter flakes, like small knives cutting sideways across her face. She leaned on a willow crutch that was far too thin for her weight, her left leg twisted beneath her skirt, her honey blonde hair coming loose from its pins, her blue eyes lifted against all the voices that wanted her to look away. She was 23 years old. She had traveled 2,000 miles to reach this square. She had eaten nothing for a day and a half, and the men of Silver Creek were pointing at her leg and calling her names that no woman should hear spoken aloud. Then the giant stepped forward. He came out of the crowd the way a storm comes off a ridge, slow and inevitable, and when he stood in front of the girl, the laughter died in the throats of the men who had started it. He was nearly 7 feet tall. His shoulders were as wide as a barn door. His beard was dark and heavy with road dust, and his eyes were the color of whiskey held up to firelight. He did not look at the mayor. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at the girl, and he took off his heavy buffalo coat, and he laid it across her trembling shoulders like a man setting a roof over a broken house. Then he turned. His voice, when it came, was not loud. It was the voice of a man who had never in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. If any man laughs at my wife one more time, he said, I will stop being polite. The square went silent. You could hear the snow falling. You could hear a horse breathing half a block away. The mayor opened his mouth and closed it again without sound. The girl looked up at the giant, and for the first time in the 13 years since her mother died, Clara Whitfield felt something warm move inside her chest. She did not know yet that the man standing in front of her was named Silas Thornwood. She did not know that he lived 40 miles up a mountain called Bitterroot. She did not know that 6 months earlier, in a boarding house in Boston, she had written him a letter that began with the words, I am not pretty, and I do not walk well, and that he had read those words by a fire in a cabin 9,000 feet in the air and said aloud to his brother, she is not lying. No one lies when they confess a thing like that. She did not know any of this yet. She only knew that a man had just put his coat on her shoulders in front of a town that wanted her to be nothing, and that the world had tilted on its axis. Before we go any further into this story, friend, I want you to tell me where you are listening from tonight. Are you sitting by a fire? Are you in a rocking chair with the lamp turned low? Are you driving a long, dark road with nothing but the yellow line ahead of you? Whatever you are doing, settle in. This one is going to take a while, and it is going to take you somewhere. If you love stories of the old frontier of men who kept their word and women who earned their place, hit that subscribe button now and leave me a comment telling me your town. I read every one. Now let me take you back. Let me take you back 6 months before that day in the Silver Creek Square to a Boston boarding house in the spring of 1878, where a young woman with a limp was deciding whether to keep living. Boston in March smelled of coal smoke and wet stone. The rain came down the chimney pots in long black streaks. Clara Whitfield stood on the top step of the Ashford house on Beacon Hill with a small trunk beside her and a carpet bag in her hand, and she had nowhere in the world to go. The door behind her had just closed. The latch had made the small, final sound that latches make when a door is not going to open again. Inside that house, Mrs. Ashford had spent the last hour telling Clara what kind of woman she was. The words had been ugly. They had been said in a parlor full of porcelain and oil paintings, and a marble clock that kept ticking all the way through. Clara had stood with her hands folded in front of her and had not wept. She had learned long ago that weeping in front of certain kinds of women only made them meaner. The truth was very simple, and the truth did not matter. The truth was that Mr. Ashford, 3 nights before, had followed Clara up the back stairs when she went to put the younger children to bed. He had cornered her on the landing. He had put his hand on her arm. Clara, who was small and walked with a cane, but who had spent 9 years in a Boston orphanage, learning how to make herself uncornerable, had pushed him hard enough that he fell against the banister and woke the housekeeper. He had told his wife the next morning that Clara had invited him. Mrs. Ashford had believed what it was easier to believe. And now Clara was standing on the front steps of the finest house on Beacon Hill in a thin gray coat with no letter of reference, no wages from the last month, and $3.40 in a small cloth purse. She had been the governess of the Ashford children for 2 years. She had taught their little girls to read French and to play the small pieces of Mozart and to curtsy without looking like they were afraid. The children had loved her. She had loved them back. It did not matter. None of that mattered on the front steps in the rain. Clara picked up the carpetbag. She stepped down onto the pavement of Beacon Hill. Her left leg, the one that had not walked properly since she was 10 years old, dragged against the whetstone. A passing carriage splashed her skirt to the hem. She did not flinch. She had been taught by a nun in an orphanage a long time ago that dignity was the last thing the world could take from you and the only thing you could not give away. Her name was Clara Whitfield. Her mother had been thrown from a carriage in the winter of '65 and had died in the snow with her daughter trapped in the wreckage beside her. That was how Clara had lost her mother and her leg in the same hour, 10 years old, on a country road outside Worcester. Her father, who had never recovered from the loss of his wife, had gone to work in a textile mill in Lowell and had burned to death in a factory fire 2 winters later. Clara had been sent to the Sisters of St. Cecilia in the Back Bay, where a crooked old nun named Sister Margaret had taken one look at the limping child and had said, "You will not be broken here, girl. Not in this house." And Sister Margaret had kept that promise. Sister Margaret had taught Clara to read Latin. She had taught her to read French. She had taught her the herbs of the hills, willow bark for pain, yarrow for bleeding, golden seal for the rot that gets into a wound, mullein for a cough, lavender for a mind that could not sleep. She had taught Clara that a woman with a broken leg who knew the names of things was not broken at all. She was only waiting for the world to catch up. Sister Margaret had died when Clara was 19. Clara had stood at the graveside in a thin black dress and had thought, now I am alone in the world. But she had not cried then either. She did not cry on the front steps of the Ashford house. She walked down Beacon Hill with her carpet bag and her trunk, and she found a cheap boarding house on the harbor side where the gulls screamed all night, and she rented a room for $1 a week, and she sat down on the narrow bed, and she counted out her $3.40, and she thought very clearly about what she would do. She would not go back to the orphanage. She was too old. She would not beg. She had too much pride, or too little, depending on which side of pride you looked at. That night, she walked to the Boston Public Library, and she sat in the reading room and she turned the pages of every newspaper she could find. She read the society columns. She read the shipping news. She read the weather in Boston and the weather in New York and the weather in San Francisco. And then on the back page of a week-old copy of Harper's Weekly, under the small print in the classified section, she read an advertisement that made her go very still. Mountain Homestead in Montana Territory seeks capable woman as bride. Hard life. Fair men. Honor required. Reply to Box 47, Silver Creek, Montana Territory. Clara read the advertisement 3 times. She read the words, fair men. She read the words, honor required. She read the words, hard life, and she thought, I have had a hard life. I know what one looks like. She went back to her rented room. She took out the paper Sister Margaret had given her, a small stack of cream-colored stationery that the old nun had kept hidden in her desk for 40 years for a student who might someday need to write an important letter. Clara sat by the window. She dipped a steel pen in cheap ink, and she wrote. She wrote honestly. She told the man at Box 47 that she was 23 years old, that she was a governess in Boston, that she had been raised by nuns, that she could read and write in 3 languages. She told him that her left leg had been injured in a carriage accident when she was 10 and that she walked with a cane. She told him that she knew the herbs of the hills and that she knew how to nurse a fever and how to set a broken bone and how to make a cabin warm in a bad winter. She told him that she was not pretty and that she did not walk well, but that she had never told a lie in her life and that she would give him everything she had if he gave her a home. She signed her name Clara Whitfield in careful round letters. She folded the letter. She enclosed a small photograph of her face that she had sat for the year before at a traveling photographer's studio on Tremont Street, a sober picture of a young woman with pale hair and very steady eyes. She addressed the envelope to Box 47, Silver Creek, Montana Territory, and she walked it down to the post office in the rain, and she paid the 3 cents, and she watched the postmaster put her letter in the westbound sack. Then she went back to the boarding house, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and for the first time since the morning the Ashford door had closed behind her, she allowed herself to shake. 2,000 miles away, at an altitude of 9,000 feet, the snow had already been falling for a week. The cabin on Bitterroot Mountain stood in the shadow of a granite wall that rose straight up behind it like the side of a cathedral. It was a 2-story house, not a shack built of whole oak logs as thick around as a man chinked tight with clay and horsehair, with a heavy slate roof that shed the snow in long blue sheets. There was a barn behind it. There was a stable. There was a small herb garden by a stable. There was a small herb garden by the south wall gone wild now, where a woman named Ruth Thornwood had once grown lavender and rosemary and the purple violets she had loved. Ruth Thornwood had been dead for 20 years. Inside the cabin by a stone fireplace, big enough for a man to walk into, 2 brothers were reading a letter. They were identical twins. They were 38 years old. They were each 6 feet 6 inches tall, with shoulders that had been built by 20 years of swinging an axe and dragging timber and carrying the bodies of elk down the side of a mountain in winter. Their hair was the color of dark chestnut, heavy and unkempt. Their eyes were amber, the exact color of the whiskey in the glass on the mantel. They looked from 20 paces like the same man twice. Up close, you could tell them apart. The older one, the one born 7 minutes earlier, had no scar on his face. His name was Silas Thornwood. He was the steady one, the one who made the decisions, the one who had buried his mother and father together in a single grave in the autumn of 1858, when a fever had swept Bitterroot and left the 2 18-year-old boys alone on the mountain. He had dug that grave himself. He had not let Ezra help him. Silas Thornwood was a man who carried his weight and the weight of the people he loved, and he had been carrying weight for 20 years. The younger one, born 7 minutes later, was Ezra Thornwood. He had a long, pale scar running from the corner of his left eye down to the line of his jaw. He had gotten that scar at a place called Gettysburg in July of 1863 when he was 23 years old and a private in the 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac. A piece of shell had opened his face and driven a small fragment of iron deep into his left lung, and the Helena doctor had said the fragment could not come out, and Ezra Thornwood had coughed for 15 years and would cough for the rest of his life. In the winters, it was worse. In the winters, he sometimes coughed blood into a handkerchief and folded the handkerchief quickly so Silas would not see. Ezra was the gentle one. He was the one who played the silver harmonica that hung on a leather thong around his neck. He was the one who did the fine carving of the cabin, the acorn on the lintel, the violets on the bedposts, the small rabbit on the handle of the butter churn. He was the one who remembered their mother's voice. He was the one who wrote the letters when letters had to be written. And it was Ezra who was reading the letter now out loud by the light of the fire. "I am not pretty," he read, "and I do not walk well." Silas Thornwood, who was standing by the fireplace with his arms folded, did not move. Ezra read on. She spoke of her parents. She spoke of a carriage accident. She spoke of a nun who had taught her Latin and French and the names of the mountain herbs. She spoke of cooking, of mending, of nursing fever, of setting bone. She spoke of a Boston household that had used her and thrown her away. She did not complain. She did not ask for pity. She said at the end, "I have never told a lie in my life, and I will give you everything I have if you give me a home." Ezra lowered the letter. He looked up at his brother across the firelight. Silas Thornwood stood very still. The fire cracked. The wind came down off the granite wall behind the cabin and pressed against the logs and moved on. Outside in the deep dark of a Montana mountain night, an owl called twice and stopped. "She is not lying," Silas said. "No," Ezra said. "No, she is not." The winter before had almost killed both of them. Ezra had coughed blood for 3 weeks in January, the old Gettysburg wound acting up in the cold, and Silas going down the frozen creek path to the ranch 2 valleys over to beg for laudanum and a bottle of whiskey strong enough to dull the pain, had slipped on a sheet of black ice and had torn his right shoulder half out of its socket. For 10 days, the two giant brothers had lain in the cabin, unable to feed each other. The fire had gone out twice. The water in the bucket had frozen solid. Ezra had crawled to the stove on his belly, coughing, and had lit the kindling with his one good hand. Silas, with his left arm working and his right arm useless and his ribs black with bruising, had dragged in wood from the lean-to with his teeth locked. They had not died. They had come close. Close enough that in March, when the thaw finally came, Silas had sat on the porch with his arm in a sling and had said aloud to the blue sky, "We cannot do this alone for another year." And Ezra, sitting beside him with a handkerchief folded in his pocket that he did not want his brother to see, had said, "No, brother, we cannot." They had put the advertisement in Harper's Weekly in April. They had put it in the St. Louis Globe and the Chicago Tribune. They had waited through the summer. The letters had come in a slow trickle sent up the mountain from Silver Creek by the occasional freighter who still made the climb before the snows. Most of the letters had been foolish. Young women promising beauty, older women promising piety. One letter had come from a woman in Chicago who had enclosed a daguerreotype of herself standing in a ball gown, and Silas had thrown that one into the fire without reading past the first page. Clara Whitfield's letter was the 7th letter. It was the only letter that had said, "I am not pretty." It was the only letter that had told the truth. Silas walked over to the small writing table by the window. He pulled out a sheet of plain brown paper. He took up the steel-nibbed pen that had been his father's, and he dipped it in the ink. He was not a man who wrote often or easily. He wrote slowly, the way another man might chop wood one stroke at a time. "Miss Whitfield," he wrote, "we are 2 brothers sharing this land. If you come, you will be the wife of Silas Thornwood. My brother Ezra will be your brother by marriage and will protect you as his own blood. We do not judge scars or limps up here. We judge by the heart. The stagecoach for Silver Creek leaves St. Louis every Tuesday. Enclosed is the fare. Come if you are willing. Silas Thornwood and Ezra Thornwood, Bitterroot Mountain, Montana Territory." He looked at the letter for a long moment. He added one more line at the bottom in smaller script in his own hand. "Miss Whitfield, you will not be laughed at here." He folded the letter around a stack of paper money. He sealed it with wax. He handed it to Ezra, and Ezra rode down the mountain the next morning to put it in the mail sack at Silver Creek. Ezra did not see that afternoon what happened when the letter Clara had first sent passed through the post office on its way up the mountain. Because in Silver Creek in the summer of 1878, the letters from Box 47 did not go straight to the Thornwood brothers. They went first by long-standing arrangement across the desk of Mayor Bartholomew Grimes, who was also the postmaster and the town treasurer and the judge of all small grievances and the landlord of the Golden Nugget Saloon. Mayor Bartholomew Grimes was a round, oily, smiling man of 55. He had thinning hair that he combed across the top of his skull. He had a gold watch chain that he polished every morning. He had the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He had come to Silver Creek in '68 broke and desperate, and he had in 10 years made himself the king of the town by simple methods. He took a cut. He took a cut of the freight of the saloon of the bordello of the mail. The Thornwood brothers, who came down from their mountain twice a year with packed trains of the finest pelts in the territory, silver fox and beaver, and bear, made Bartholomew Grimes sick with greed every time he laid eyes on them. Grimes read Clara Whitfield's letter at his desk in the back of the Nugget. He read it slowly. He read the line about the limp. He read the line about "I am not pretty." He looked at the photograph of the young woman with the steady eyes. He smiled a slow, quiet smile that did not reach his eyes. And he did something he had been waiting for 10 years to have a reason to do. He read the letter a second time. He copied the return address from the envelope onto a slip of paper and folded that slip into his waistcoat pocket. He slid the photograph of Clara's face into the top drawer of his desk, and he locked the drawer. He would need the photograph later for the Denver buyer. The letter itself he sealed again carefully with a dab of fresh wax that matched the original, and he let it go up the mountain in the freighter's sack. Let the Thornwood brothers read her words. Let them send the fare. Let them expect a bride. He would meet the girl himself at the stage. By the time the brothers came down looking for a wife who never arrived, the wife would already be southbound in a closed coach to Denver. And Bartholomew Grimes would be the sympathetic mayor who shook their hands and said, "Gentlemen, I am so very sorry, she simply never came." The plan Bartholomew Grimes laid out over a whiskey that evening with Mrs. Prudence Whitmore was very simple and very ugly. Mrs. Prudence Whitmore was the wife of the president of the Silver Creek Stockman's Bank. She was 51 years old. She had a hard, thin mouth and a set of small blue eyes that had been disappointed for so long they had become cruel. 2 years before, she had sent her daughter Cordelia, a pretty girl of 19, up to the Thornwood cabin with her father under the pretense of a land survey, because she had decided that Silas Thornwood, 6'6" and owning 4,000 acres of timber and mineral rights, was going to be her son-in-law. Silas Thornwood, over a cup of black coffee in his own kitchen, had looked at Cordelia Whitmore across the table for exactly 1 minute and had said to her father, "Mr. Whitmore, your daughter is a fine young lady, and she does not belong on this mountain. Send her back to St. Louis." That had been all. Cordelia had wept. Mrs. Whitmore had never forgiven. 2 years was a long time to carry a hate in a town as small as Silver Creek. Grimes leaned forward over his whiskey. "When the girl arrives," he said, "I will meet her at the stage. I will discover to my great horror that she is a cripple. I will tell her that the Thornwood brothers will not accept such a bride. I will offer her in my mercy a position with a quiet family in Denver." "A quiet family," he said, and he smiled. "She will be put on the southbound coach before the Thornwoods even know she has come. The brothers will receive word that she did not arrive. They will be embarrassed. They will be humiliated. And in their shame, madam, they will do what lonely, humiliated men always do. They will sell their pelts cheap to whoever will still look them in the eye. And who, madam, will be the generous buyer who overlooks their shame?" Mrs. Prudence Whitmore lifted her whiskey glass. Her thin, cruel mouth made a small, hard smile. "And the girl," she said, "the girl," Grimes said, "will be $40 in Denver. Cash." They clinked their glasses. Outside, the first hard snow of the Montana winter had begun to fall on the tin roofs of Silver Creek. And 1,000 miles to the east, in a boarding house on the Boston waterfront, Clara Whitfield was opening the envelope that had been handed up to her by the landlady. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed. She broke the seal with her thumb. She unfolded the brown paper. She read twice the words, "We do not judge scars or limps up here. We judge by the heart." And then she read in a different hand, smaller at the bottom of the page, "You will not be laughed at here. Clara Whitfield, who had not wept on the steps of the Ashford house, and who had not wept at the grave of Sister Margaret, and who had not wept the night her father burned to death in the Lowell mill, now sat on the edge of a rented bed, in a rented room, on a rented street, in a city that had never wanted her, and she bent her face into her hands and she wept. She wept for a long time. Then she washed her face in the cold water of the basin. She packed her trunk. She counted the money that had come with the letter, and she tied it carefully into a cotton handkerchief and pinned it inside the lining of her coat. She wrote a note to the landlady thanking her for her kindness. She left the note with $3 on the bedside table. She took her carpet bag and her trunk and her willow crutch, and at 6 in the morning on a rainy Thursday in the first week of September of 1878, she boarded a westbound train out of Boston. It took her 3 weeks to reach Silver Creek. The train took her to Albany, to Buffalo, to Chicago, to St. Louis. The stagecoach took her from St. Louis over rivers and plains and eventually into the tall, broken country of the Northern Rockies for 11 more days. She traveled with a carpet bag on her lap and her willow crutch between her knees. At night, she slept in the women's side of the stage inns on straw ticks in rooms with 6 other women, and she did not speak much, and she did not eat much, and she kept her small purse pinned inside her dress. In the last 4 days of the ride, a lean, wolfish-looking man in a black coat sat in the corner of the coach and watched her with yellow eyes and did not speak. His name, though she did not know it yet, was Ezekiel Crane, and Mayor Bartholomew Grimes had sent him to St. Louis by telegram to make sure the girl did not change her mind and slip off the coach before it reached Silver Creek. She did not slip away. She had no reason to. She was going home. At least she believed she was. The stagecoach crested the last high pass in the morning of September 29th, 1878, and came down into the valley of Silver Creek under a sky the color of slate. The first snow of the Montana winter had just begun to fall. Clara Whitfield leaned her face to the window of the coach. She saw the dirty roofs of a mining town. She saw the long street of mud. She saw a crowd beginning to gather on the porch of the Golden Nugget Saloon. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and her heart began to beat very fast because she believed she was about to meet her husband. She did not know that Silas and Ezra Thornwood were at that moment 40 miles up a mountain, skinning elk, and had not been told that the coach was coming. She did not know that Mayor Bartholomew Grimes was at that moment stepping down off the porch of the Golden Nugget with a smile that did not reach his eyes. She did not know that a trap laid months earlier in a back room over a glass of whiskey was about to close around her. The coach stopped. The door opened. A man she had never seen before held out a soft-gloved hand and said in a voice as warm as poured honey, "Miss Whitfield, welcome to Silver Creek. I am Mayor Grimes. Let me help you down." Clara Whitfield took his hand, and she stepped down onto the mud of Montana, and she did not know that the next 6 hours of her life were going to be the worst she had ever lived. You are going to want to stay with me for what comes next, friend, because what Mayor Bartholomew Grimes is about to do to Clara Whitfield in the main square of Silver Creek is going to be heard by the wind and by the mountain, and the wind is going to carry it up 40 miles of switchback trail to a cabin at 9,000 feet, where 2 giant brothers named Thornwood are skinning an elk and do not yet know that their bride has been stolen at the stage. But they are about to know. And when they find out, the men of Silver Creek are going to learn for the first time in 10 years what it means when the Thornwood brothers come down off that mountain at the same time. The mayor walked Clara across the muddy street with his hand under her elbow. He was smiling. He was speaking in a low, concerned, fatherly voice. He said, "My dear, there has been a terrible misunderstanding. The Thornwood brothers, I am afraid to tell you, are not men who would welcome a bride in your condition." Clara stopped walking. She looked up at him. The snow was falling into her hair. Her willow crutch was sinking into the mud. "What condition?" she said. Grimes glanced down at her leg. He did it sadly the way a man shakes his head over a dying horse. "Your infirmity, my dear," he said. "Those brothers are mountain men. They need a strong woman, an able-bodied woman. They will send you back on the next coach, and they will be furious with me for letting you come up. I cannot allow that to happen to you." But he said, and his hand tightened on her elbow just slightly, "But I have a friend in Denver, a fine family. They need a governess. A woman of your talents would be very welcome there. The southbound coach leaves in 2 hours. I have already taken the liberty of reserving your seat." Clara stood in the mud. The snow was falling harder now. She looked up into the face of Mayor Bartholomew Grimes, and she saw very clearly for the first time what his smile actually was. It was the smile of Mr. Ashford on the back stairs in Boston. It was the smile of the overseer at the Lowell mill who had once told her father when the wages were short that a man with a limping daughter always had something he could sell. It was the smile of every man who had ever looked at her leg and decided that the rest of her was for sale. Clara Whitfield, who was 23 years old and 5'3", and who had $3 in the fair money pinned inside her coat, and who weighed 105 pounds, and who walked with a willow crutch, looked up into that smile, and she did something that Mayor Bartholomew Grimes, in 10 years of running the town of Silver Creek, had never had a woman do to him before. She pulled her elbow out of his hand. She took one step back. She said, in a voice that did not shake, "I would like to meet my husband first. Sir, if they send me away, I will go to Denver, but I will meet them first. I have come 2,000 miles. I will meet them." The mayor's smile faltered, just for a half second, just at the edges. Then it came back, but this time it did not pretend to be kind. "My dear," he said, "I am afraid that is not possible." "It is possible," Clara said quietly. "I am standing here. You will send a rider. You will tell them I have come. If they reject me, I will board the Denver coach with no argument. But you will send the rider." Around them on the porches of Silver Creek, the first people had begun to gather. Miners in muddy boots, women in aprons, a boy with a feed sack over his shoulder. They could not hear the words. They could see a young crippled woman standing in the snow with her crutch and saying no to the mayor. And a ripple of something moved through the crowd. Surprise, amusement, a hungry curiosity. The look a town gets when it smells a show coming. Mayor Bartholomew Grimes felt the crowd behind him. He felt his own anger begin to rise. And he made in that moment the mistake that would 2 days later cost him everything. He raised his voice. He spoke so the town could hear. "Very well, Miss Whitfield," he said loudly, and the honey was gone, now replaced by something sharp and cruel. "If you insist on making a spectacle of yourself, we shall summon the Thornwood brothers. And in the meantime, my good people of Silver Creek shall have an opportunity to see exactly what was ordered for them by post." He stepped away from her. He gestured at her with a theatrical hand. He addressed the porches. "Behold," he cried, "the Thornwood bride, 40 miles up the mountain on a broken leg to wed a man who does not know she is coming. I ask you, neighbors, is this not a cruelty? Is this not a joke?" And the town of Silver Creek, which had been bored since the last lynching in August, looked at the small, limping girl standing in the mud, and the town began slowly to laugh. Clara Whitfield stood in the center of the main square of Silver Creek, Montana Territory, with the snow falling into her hair, and she lifted her chin. She did not cry. She did not look away. She had been through worse. She had been through the long gray train to Chicago, and the 11 days on the stagecoach, and the yellow eyes of the lean man in the black coat who had watched her all the way from St. Louis. She had not come 2,000 miles to break in the last 10 feet. She lifted her chin and she stood. And then from a great distance from the top of the long street came the sound of hooves on frozen mud. Slow hooves, heavy hooves. The sound of 2 pack mules and 2 saddle horses coming down out of the high country. The laughter in the square began to die. The first thing Clara saw was 2 men on horseback so tall in the saddle that their heads almost touched the porch roofs as they rode past. 2 men who looked like the same man twice. Dark coats, dark beards, the amber eyes of a wolf at dusk. The Thornwood brothers had come down off Bitterroot Mountain. And Mayor Bartholomew Grimes, standing in the middle of the main square of Silver Creek, turned his head to look at them, and for the first time in 10 years, the smile on his face went away and did not come back. The Thornwood brothers did not speak as they rode down Main Street. They rode the way they always rode when they came down out of the mountain slow, and side by side letting the horses pick their own way through the frozen mud. Silas on the left on the big black gelding he had raised from a colt. Ezra on the right on the dun mare with the white blaze. 2 pack mules behind them loaded down with bundles of pelts wrapped in oiled canvas. The snow was falling straight down now, No wind, the flakes catching in the dark wool of their coats and the dark, heavy wool of their beards. They had been skinning elk at first light when the boy on the piebald pony had come up the switchback trail shouting. A woman, the boy had said, breathing hard. A woman has come on the stage. For you, the mayor has her in the square. Silas Thornwood had set down his skinning knife very slowly. He had looked at his brother across the carcass of the elk, and something had passed between them. Something that did not need words the way it is between twins who have shared a cabin for 38 years and a mother's grave for 20. They had washed the blood off their hands in the trough. They had saddled the horses without speaking. They had come down the 40 miles of switchback in 4 hours, which no man in the territory had ever done before, and they had come into Silver Creek at a walk because you do not gallop a horse onto a street you plan to walk off of. Now they rode into the square, and the square went quiet. Silas saw her first. He saw a small woman standing in the middle of the muddy square with a willow crutch under her left arm. He saw pale hair coming loose from its pins. He saw a thin gray traveling coat that had been good once and was no longer good. He saw a small leather trunk at her feet. He saw her chin lifted, and he saw even from 30 paces that her eyes were the color of cornflowers in a June field, and that they were not crying and that they were looking directly back at him. He swung down from the black gelding in one slow motion, his heavy boots landing in the mud with a soft, deep sound, and he walked across the square with the reins still in his hand, and the crowd parted for him without a word because no crowd in the territory did not part for a Thornwood when a Thornwood was walking. He stopped in front of Clara Whitfield. Up close, she was smaller than he had thought. The top of her head came barely to the center of his chest. He could see the cold in her cheeks. He could see that her willow crutch was splitting a long crack running up the grain, and that she was putting weight on a tool that was about to fail her. He could see that her left hand, the one gripping the crutch, was raw and red from the long cold drive up from the stage. He did not speak to her yet. He unbuttoned his heavy buffalo coat, the long one lined with sheepskin, that his father had made him when he was 20, and he took it off and he laid it across her shoulders. It swallowed her. It fell past her knees. She lifted her face to look up at him, and her mouth opened just a little because no one in 13 years had put a coat on her shoulders in public. Then Silas turned around. He looked at Mayor Bartholomew Grimes. He looked at the crowd. If any man, Silas Thornwood said, and his voice was not loud, if any man laughs at my wife one more time, I will stop being polite. The silence that followed was the deepest silence the town of Silver Creek had known in 10 years. A dog barked once 2 blocks away and stopped. The snow went on falling. Somewhere down the street, a door opened and closed very softly. Ezra Thornwood had come down off the dun mare and was standing behind his brother's left shoulder, the way he had stood at Gettysburg, the way he had stood at every grave and every fight and every hard winter since they had been boys. Ezra did not speak. Ezra did not need to. Ezra had one hand resting very lightly on the handle of the long skinning knife at his belt, and every man in the square saw it. Mayor Bartholomew Grimes opened his mouth. He closed it again. His smile, which had lived on his face for 10 years, had fallen off like something shimmered in a mold, and he could not seem to find it again. Silas turned back to Clara. He lowered his voice. The voice he used for her was not the voice he had used for the square. It was a quieter voice, a gentler voice, a voice like the voice a man uses with a horse that has been beaten by the wrong owner. Miss Whitfield, he said, I am Silas Thornwood. This is my brother Ezra. We are sorry to be late. We did not know you were coming today. We will take you home now, if that is what you want. Clara Whitfield looked up into the amber eyes of the man she had written a letter to in the spring, and she had been holding a great deal of weight on her broken willow crutch and on her thin coat and on her dignity for a very long time, and something inside her finally let go just a little, just at the edges. Her eyes filled. She did not let the tears fall. She nodded. Once. Then I would like to go home, she said. Silas Thornwood turned his head to his brother. Ezra stepped forward wordless and lifted Clara's small leather trunk onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He walked it to the dun mare. He strapped it to the saddle. He walked back. He did not look at the mare either. Neither of them had looked at the mare once. Silas put one big calloused hand under Clara's elbow, the way a father does with a daughter at a wedding, and he walked her the 20 feet to his black gelding. He did not pick her up yet. He gave her time. He said in the same low voice, "Miss Whitfield, I am going to lift you into the saddle now. Tell me if that is not all right." "That is all right," Clara said. He lifted her. He did it the way a man lifts a child out of a deep river, strong and careful, and he set her into the saddle of the black gelding, as if she weighed nothing at all, and he arranged the buffalo coat around her so that the cold could not reach her knees, and he handed her the reins and folded her small hands around them himself. Then he stepped back. He looked one last time across the square. His eyes went past the crowd to the porch of the Golden Nugget where Mayor Bartholomew Grimes stood with his hands flat on the railing and his face gone the color of old paper. Silas Thornwood said, loud enough for the whole town to hear, "We do not judge scars or limps up here. We judge by the heart. You people would do well to remember that. The pelts you are going to buy from us today will not be sold in Silver Creek this year, nor next year, nor for as long as I live. Good day to you." And then the Thornwood brothers walked out of the square at the head of their mules, one man leading the black gelding with Clara on its back, the other man walking behind with his hand near his knife, and the snow kept falling, and the town of Silver Creek stood in the mud and watched them go, and no one, not one man, not one woman laughed. The trail up Bitterroot Mountain was called by the few people who had ever tried to climb it the Widow's Trail. It had been named in '64 when a woman named Martha Clay had tried to follow her husband up it in February and had been found 9 days later frozen sitting upright against a pine tree 3 miles from the top. The trail climbed 4,000 feet in 40 miles, and it did this by way of a long switchback that in places narrowed to the width of a single horse with a granite wall on one side and a drop of 600 feet on the other. It was not a road. It was barely a path. It was the reason the Thornwood brothers had never had a neighbor within a day's ride and had never particularly wanted one. They climbed in silence for the first hour. Silas walked ahead leading the black gelding by the reins, picking the gentler line of the two possible lines through every stretch of frozen scree. Ezra walked behind the pack mules, watching for loose stones, coughing once into his gloved fist and folding the glove away before his brother could see. Clara sat in the saddle of the black gelding under the huge weight of the buffalo coat. The coat was so heavy it held her to the horse like an anchor. She did not speak. She watched the back of Silas Thornwood's head. She watched the way he walked. He walked the way a man walks who has been walking the same trail for 30 years. The way a man walks who knows every loose stone on it. The way a man walks who is not in a hurry because he has arrived. At the first hour, he stopped at a bend where a thin thread of creek water came out of the rock wall. He stopped not for himself. He did not need to stop. He stopped because he had noticed something half a mile back that a man who did not watch the trail for a living would not have noticed. He walked back to the gelding. He looked up at Clara. His amber eyes were narrow in the gray light. "Miss Whitfield," he said quietly, "you are bleeding." Clara looked down. A thin line of red had soaked through the worn black leather of her left boot and was running down the stirrup leather. She had not felt it. She had stopped feeling her left leg an hour before. The boot, which had been too stiff for the journey, and the long stand in the mud of Silver Creek, and the bracing against the stirrup, had opened the old scar along her calf where the carriage had broken her. "I am sorry," she said at once. "I am sorry. I will be fine. I did not mean to." Silas Thornwood did not answer. He turned his head just slightly and said, "Ezra." Ezra came up. Ezra looked at the boot. He did not speak either. Ezra walked to the dun mare and came back with a small leather satchel, the satchel that had been his mother's, and he opened it on a flat rock by the thin thread of creek water. Inside were rolls of clean linen bandage, a small bottle of oil that smelled of rosemary and beeswax, a folded paper of dried yarrow. Ezra looked up at Clara from where he knelt. He did not quite smile. He said in his quieter voice, the voice that had spoken to dying boys at Gettysburg, "Miss Whitfield, we are going to take your boot off. My brother and I have set bones on each other and on 3 horses and on one very unhappy mountain lion. We will not hurt you. Will you allow it?" Clara looked down at him. "Yes," she said softly, "I will allow it." Silas lifted her out of the saddle as he had lifted her into it, the same careful strength, and he set her on the flat rock where the creek came out of the wall. Ezra knelt in front of her. He unlaced the boot with slow fingers. He eased it off. Her stocking underneath was dark with blood. He did not look up at her face. He did not want her to feel watched. He rinsed the stocking down with cold creek water and peeled it away, and he saw the long old scar on her calf, pale and puckered, the scar of a 10-year-old girl pulled out of a broken carriage by strangers in a winter field outside Worcester. A fresh cut had opened along the top of the old scar where the boot had chafed. It was not deep. It was only bleeding because bone scars bleed easy. Ezra poured a small amount of the rosemary oil onto a scrap of clean linen. He laid it against the cut. He did it gently, the way he would have done it for a horse or for a brother or for a boy in a blue coat with a belly wound under a peach tree in Pennsylvania. "How do you know how I hurt?" Clara said. Her voice was very small. Ezra lifted his eyes just a little, and she saw the long pale scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw, and she saw for the first time what his scar and her scar had in common. "The scar on my face hurts on cold days too," he said. "We recognize each other." Clara Whitfield, who had sat on the cold stone steps of Beacon Hill and not wept, and who had stood in the square of Silver Creek and not wept, looked down at the top of Ezra Thornwood's dark head where he was binding linen around her calf, and she felt 2 tears go down her face, and she did not stop them. She did not sob. They only fell once, and she wiped them away with the back of her glove. Silas stood 3 paces away, holding the reins of the black gelding, looking off down the valley where the snow was falling on the gray pines, and he did not turn his head. He was giving her the privacy of her own face, but his jaw was set, and his free hand, the one not on the reins, was a slow fist at his side. When they mounted up again, Silas did not put her on the black gelding. He looked at his brother, and something passed between them again without a word. Ezra nodded once and swung up on the dun mare with the pack line. Silas lifted Clara up into the saddle of the black gelding, and then he swung up behind her. He did not touch her more than he had to. He held the reins around her shoulders without his arms touching her sides. He held her in the saddle the way a father holds a sleeping daughter, not by taking hold of her, but by being a wall behind her that she could not fall through. "We will ride double the last 15 miles, he said low near her ear. "You are tired. My horse is strong. Lean back when you need to." She did not lean back, not for a long time. But near the end, near sunset, when the last of the light was going blue on the granite wall above them, and the wind was coming down off the pass in small whining gusts, her head dropped without her permission, and her shoulder touched his chest, and she slept for the last 3 miles of the widow's trail with the weight of Silas Thornwood behind her, and the heartbeat of a man she did not yet know moving slow and steady against the top of her back. The cabin appeared out of the blue dusk like something built by giants. She had thought all the way up the trail that a cabin 9,000 feet up a mountain would be a shack, a lean-to, a place where men kept out of the rain. What she saw when they came around the last turn was a 2-story house of whole oak logs, its slate roof heavy with snow, a barn behind it, a stable beside it, a stone chimney smoking slow in the still air. A wall of granite rose straight up behind it into the last of the light, as tall as a cathedral, and the cabin sat in its shadow the way a child sits at the feet of its mother. "Home," Silas said low near her ear, and she woke all the way up. He lifted her down. Her legs did not hold her. He did not comment. He stood close and let her take her balance on him the way she would have taken it on a railing, and he did not move until she told him she was ready. Ezra put the horses in the stable. Silas carried the trunk. Clara walked the last 20 feet to the porch on her broken willow crutch, and he let her walk it herself because he had already understood in 4 hours on a trail that Clara Whitfield was a woman who needed to walk her own last steps into her own house. He pushed the heavy oak door open. Inside, the cabin was warm. There was a stone fireplace on the long wall burning low. There was a broad pine table. There were shelves. There were guns on pegs. There were stacks of pelts in the corners. There was, Clara saw at once, an absolute and complete absence of any woman having lived there for a very long time. Dust on the shelves, dried mud on the floor, a plate with a piece of old bread on it, a coat thrown across a chair, the smell of wood smoke and leather and bachelor neglect. And yet there was in the cabin a thing she had not expected. There was order, not cleanliness, no, but order. The rifles on the pegs were in a row. The axes by the fire were stacked by size. The pelts in the corner had been bundled and tied. This was not the cabin of men who did not care. This was the cabin of men who cared about the right things and had simply run out of time for the rest. Silas set her trunk down by the foot of the stairs. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "your room is up the stairs. It was my mother's. It has a door that locks from the inside. No one will enter without your permission. That is the law at Bitterroot." Clara looked up at him. "The law at Bitterroot," she said, trying the words quietly. "The law at Bitterroot," he said. She climbed the stairs slowly on the willow crutch, her good hand on the rail. The room at the top was small, a narrow iron bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the black wall of pines, a carved wooden box on the dresser, violets on the lid, a quilt on the bed stitched a long time ago by a woman named Ruth Thornwood. The colors faded now, but the stitches still tight. Clara Whitfield set her carpet bag on the floor. She sat on the edge of the bed. She put her hands in her lap. The quiet of the cabin was so deep it seemed to have a sound. That night she did not come down to eat. She could not. She had crossed 2,000 miles in a town full of laughter, in a trail named for a dead woman, and her bones had nothing left. She pulled the old quilt up to her chin. She listened through the floorboards to the low sound of the two brothers moving around in the kitchen below. She heard the scrape of a chair. She heard the soft breath of a harmonica played so quietly it was barely a sound at all. The song was Shenandoah. She had heard it in Boston once, played by a street musician on a corner in the cold. She closed her eyes. She slept. Downstairs at the pine table by the fire, Ezra Thornwood set down the harmonica and looked across at his brother, and Silas Thornwood sat with a cup of black coffee in his big calloused hand and stared into the fire for a long time. "She is very brave," Ezra said at last. "Yes," Silas said. "She is not going to last the winter if we do not take care," Ezra said. "She will last," Silas said. "She will last longer than we will." Ezra looked at his brother. "Brother," he said, "careful, very careful. Do not fall in love with her." Silas Thornwood did not answer. The fire cracked. The wind went over the roof. Somewhere up the granite wall, an owl called twice and stopped. "It is too late," Ezra, Silas said quietly. "I have already." Ezra Thornwood looked at his brother's face in the firelight, and he did not say anything more that night, because he had understood the moment he saw Silas lay the buffalo coat on her shoulders in the square what was going to happen on this mountain. The first week was not a romance. The first week was a slow, quiet war. Silas Thornwood had been a man alone with his brother for 20 years. His rhythms were not rhythms that made room for a third person in a cabin. He woke before dawn. He went out to the barn. He checked the trap lines. He came in at dusk. He ate what was in the pot. He went to bed. These were the motions of his life, and they did not know how to bend. Clara tried. God knows she tried. On her second morning, she took a wooden bucket and went down to the creek below the cabin to fetch water, and the slope defeated her. She slipped. The bucket rolled. The cold water soaked her skirt to the hip. She crawled back up on her hands and the good knee. Silas, coming out of the barn, saw her halfway up and set down the harness he was mending and walked down and picked up the bucket without speaking and carried it up and set it by the kitchen door and went back to his harness without speaking. He was not angry. He was something worse. He was silent. On the third day, she tried to split kindling. The axe was too heavy. It came down crooked. She opened a small cut on her own thumb and dropped the axe in the snow. Ezra, coming around the corner of the woodshed, saw her standing over the axe with her thumb in her mouth and her blue eyes hot and furious with herself. And he came over and picked up the axe and split the kindling for her in 3 strokes and handed her the pieces and said softly, "Give yourself a little time, Miss Whitfield. You just came over a mountain." And she wanted to thank him, and she could not because her throat was too tight. On the 4th night, she made supper. It was a venison stew. She had cooked since she was 12. She could cook well. She had gathered that afternoon a handful of wild sage from the old garden under the snow, and she had rubbed it into the meat, and the cabin smelled of something other than leather and bachelor neglect for the first time in 20 years. She lifted the heavy cast-iron pot from the hook above the fire to carry it to the table. Her left leg buckled. The pot hit the packed dirt floor. The stew, the meat, the broth, the long, slow simmered work of a whole afternoon went across the floor and onto the boots of Silas Thornwood, who was just coming in through the door with an armful of cordwood. The cabin went very still. Clara stood with her hands at her sides. She did not move. She waited. She had lived in the house of Mrs. Ashford for 2 years. She knew what came next. She had prepared herself for it on the stagecoach. She knew that there was always a moment in the house of a man when the man finally showed you what he really was. And she had decided a long time ago that when that moment came in this cabin, she would not beg and she would not cry. She would only stand and accept the words and pack her trunk in the morning. Silas Thornwood set the cordwood down on the hearth. He looked at the stew on his boots. He looked at Clara. What came out was not what he meant to say. What came out was 20 years of swallowed fear and one bad winter too many, and the memory of a brother coughing blood into a handkerchief in January, and it came out too loud and too fast and too hard. He said, "Damn it, woman." He said, "I hunt it and I skin it and I drag it home. Can you not even put it on the table?" The fire cracked once. Clara did not move. She did not cry. She only looked at him. Ezra Thornwood, who had just come in behind his brother with another armload of wood, set his own load down very slowly. He walked across the cabin until he was standing beside Silas. He did not touch him. He only said in a voice only his brother could hear Silas, "Go outside, now." Silas Thornwood turned on his heel and went out into the snow. The heavy oak door slammed behind him hard enough to shake dust down out of the rafters. Ezra crossed the cabin to Clara. He did not reach for her. He knelt down on the dirt floor and began without a word to scoop the spilled stew back into the pot with his bare hands. After a moment, Clara knelt down beside him and helped. They cleaned the floor together in silence. When it was done, Ezra sat back on his heels. He looked at her. His scar was very pale in the firelight. "He did not shout at you, Miss Whitfield," he said softly. "He shouted at last winter. He shouted at every year we have been up here alone. He shouted at his own fear that you are going to die on this mountain because of him. He is a man who has carried too much for too long, and when the weight slips, sometimes he roars. It is not you. But I know," he said, and he looked away into the fire. "I know it felt like you." Clara sat on the dirt floor of the cabin with her skirt dark with spilled broth and her hands smelling of sage, and she looked at Ezra Thornwood, and she said quietly, "In Boston, Mr. Thornwood, a man who shouted at me had already hit me or was about to. I am not used to a man who shouts and then walks outside." Ezra flinched, not at her, at all the men she had said that about. "Up here," he said, "a man who shouts walks outside. If he ever does anything else in this cabin, Miss Whitfield, you will tell me, and I will handle my brother, who is the other half of me and whom I love, and who would rather cut off his own right hand than frighten you. Do you hear me?" "I hear you," Clara said. Good, Ezra said. Now, let's save what we can of this stew. It smelled too good to waste. And somehow sitting on the dirt floor of a mountain cabin with a man she had known for 4 days, Clara Whitfield laughed. It was a small laugh. It was a tired laugh. But it was the first laugh out of her since Beacon and Hill. Outside in the snow, Silas Thornwood stood with his forehead against the cold, rough bark of a pine tree and called himself names that no other man alive would have dared to call him. He came back inside an hour later. The stew had been mostly saved. Clara had set 3 bowls on the table. She was sitting at her place with her hands folded, waiting. Ezra was at his place sipping coffee, eyes on the fire. Silas walked to the table. He did not sit. Miss Whitfield, he said, I am a poor excuse for a husband, and I am sorrier than I know how to say. Clara looked up at him. Her blue eyes were steady. Mr. Thornwood, she said, sit down and eat your supper. It is only stew. The floor washed clean. He sat, he ate. When he was done, he stood up and put on his coat and went out into the shed without a word. Clara looked at Ezra. Ezra shrugged. Let him be, he said. He is making something. What is he making? Clara said. You will see, Ezra said. The next morning before breakfast, Silas Thornwood came into the kitchen carrying a piece of hickory wood the color of dark honey. He had worked on it most of the night. The grain was smooth as glass. The handle had been shaped to fit a small hand. Along the shaft in a place where only she would see it when she walked, Ezra had carved at his brother's, asking the small shape of a violet. Silas set the cane against Clara's chair. The willow one was going to break on you on the trail, he said, not looking at her. Hickory holds the weight better. He walked out to the barn. Clara sat at the kitchen table and put her hand on the smooth hickory cane and traced the violet with her thumb, and she thought very quietly, so quietly that even she almost did not hear it. I am home. I have come home. The snow that had started falling the day she came up the trail did not stop. It fell for a week. It fell for 2 weeks. By the second week of October, the cabin was buried to the lower windows, and the trail to Silver Creek was closed, and the pass was shut, and the 3 of them were alone on Bitterroot Mountain with nothing but the fire and the stove and the wind and each other. Clara did not try to haul water anymore. She did not try to split kindling. She did what she could do, and it turned out that what she could do was change everything. She found the herb garden under the snow the one Ruth Thornwood had planted in 1850, and she dug down through the drifts, and she gathered the sleeping stalks of lavender and rue and wild sage and rosemary, and she dried them in small bundles over the stove. She tore old wool blankets into strips and braided them with dried creek grass and stuffed them into the chinking cracks between the oak logs, and the wind that had whistled through the cabin for 20 years very suddenly did not whistle anymore. The air in the cabin grew still and warm. She scrubbed the pine table with sand and creek water until the grain of the wood came back pale as bread. She found a daguerreotype of Ruth and Josiah Thornwood in a drawer, a wedding picture, the only one that had ever been made, and she cleaned the tarnished frame and set it on the mantel. When Silas came in at dusk on the evening, she put the daguerreotype up. He stopped in the doorway. He did not say anything. He looked at his mother's face on the mantel for a long time. Then he walked past it and hung his coat on the peg and sat down to supper, and his voice when he spoke to his brother at the table that night was a gentler voice than Ezra had heard out of him since they were boys. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, the 3 of them. Clara read aloud. She had brought 3 books in her trunk: Leaves of Grass, the poems of Emily Dickinson, a King James Bible that had been Sister Margaret's. Silas, who had not read a book since he was 16, sat with his boots off and his long legs stretched to the fire, and he listened the way a man listens who has gone a long time without hearing a woman's voice in his house. Ezra played the harmonica quietly for the pauses between poems. He played Shenandoah. He played Hard Times Come Again No More. He played one night a slow, sad song called Lorena, and Clara saw that his eyes were wet, and she did not say anything. It was that same night that Ezra told her about Gettysburg. He told her about the peach orchard. He told her about the girl he had been going to marry, who had married another man in 1864, while he lay in an army hospital in Maryland, spitting up iron and not dying. He told her quietly about the iron still in his lung, about the cough, about the fact that he was not going to be a long-lived one, and that he had made peace with it, and that his peace had been for 15 years, watching his brother walk up and down Bitterroot Mountain in all weathers, and knowing that the Thornwood name was going to live after them in Silas if Silas ever found someone. He did not look at Clara when he said the last part. He only looked at the fire. "Winter always ends, Miss Whitfield," he said softly. "That is what my brother says. He has been saying it to me for 15 winters, and it turns out he is right. Winter always ends." Clara sat on the bench by the fire with a hickory cane across her lap. "Winter always ends," she said. Across the hearth, Silas Thornwood, who had not spoken in an hour, lifted his amber eyes and looked at her and said nothing, and looked into the fire again. Later that night, when Clara had gone up to her mother's bed under her mother's quilt, Ezra put the harmonica back on its leather thong around his neck and looked across the dying fire at his brother. "Silas, brother, promise me something." Silas looked at him. "Promise me," Ezra said, "that before the spring, you will find the courage to tell her. Because, brother, I watched a boy die in a peach orchard one afternoon with the word for a girl's name on his lips, and I swore to myself that night that no Thornwood would ever again leave a word like that unsaid under a sky." The fire cracked, the wind pressed against the oak logs and moved on. Somewhere out past the cabin, in the enormous black silence of the mountain, an owl called twice and stopped. "I will tell her," Silas Thornwood said quietly. "Before the spring, I will." The dawn came cold and clear on the morning Ezra found the tracks. He had gone out before first light to check the trap line along the eastern slope. The new snow from the night before was 6 inches deep and unmarked by anything larger than a fox, and he was walking the slow, careful walk of a man who had walked this same line for 20 years. The harmonica on its leather thong bumped against his chest with each step. The cough in his left lung, the iron cough that had lived in him since the peach orchard, was quiet in the dry, cold air. Then he came to the place where the deer trail crossed the creek above the cabin, and he stopped. He stopped the way a man stops when the hair on the back of his neck lifts without his permission. 3 men had crossed the creek in the night. 3 men on foot. The prints were heavy, the stride long, the boots solid and not snow-packed, the kind of boots a working cowhand would not own. Behind the 3 sets of boot prints came the cleaner track of a single-horse ironshod, not the smooth steel of a Thornwood mule. Ezra knelt down beside the prints. He put a gloved hand flat on one of them. "Not old, yeah, not 4 hours old." He did not say anything out loud. He only lifted his head slow and looked up the dark spine of the mountain behind him, the way a man looks who is suddenly very aware that he is standing alone on an open slope. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin, and he walked faster than a man with a half-lung should walk, and he did not cough because he would not let himself cough. Inside the cabin, Clara was stirring the oatmeal pot. The fire was low. Silas was at the table sharpening his skinning knife on a long leather strop, his big hands moving in the slow, steady rhythm they always moved in. The daguerreotype of Ruth and Josiah Thornwood watched the room from the mantel. Ezra stepped through the door and pushed it shut behind him and set the bar across it. Silas lifted his eyes. "Trouble," he said. 3 men, Ezra said. 1 horse. Crossed the creek at the upper bend in the dark. Iron shoes. They came up the hard way, not the trail. Silas set down the strop. He set down the knife. He looked at Clara. Clara had stopped stirring the oatmeal. She stood with the wooden spoon in her hand and her cornflower eyes steady on Silas, waiting the way a woman waits who has learned in 13 years of a hard life since her mother died that bad news is not made better by pretending not to hear it. "Sit down, Miss Whitfield," Silas said quietly. "There is something we need to tell you." She sat. Silas told her. He told her about Mayor Bartholomew Grimes, and about the pelts, and about the lean wolfish man who had been in the square the day of the stage, the one he had spotted over the mayor's shoulder, and had not mentioned the one with the yellow eyes and the black coat. He told her about Ezekiel Crane. He told her what he believed the mayor had planned in September and what he believed the mayor had not given up on in October, and what 3 sets of boot prints on a deer trail at 9,000 feet meant on a November morning. He told her the truth he had not told her, that the mayor had read her letter before the freighter brought it up the mountain, that the mayor had kept the photograph of her face out of that envelope before he sent the envelope onto the cabin, that the mayor had planned from the moment he read the word cripple in her handwriting to meet her at the stage and put her on the southbound coach to Denver before the Thornwood brothers ever knew she had arrived, that the Thornwood brothers had in fact read her true letter and had loved her for it and had sent for her in good faith, but that the trap had been laid around her anyway, in the town, in the square, in the southbound coach, that had been waiting 2 blocks from the Golden Nugget. Clara Whitfield sat at the pine table with her hands folded in front of her. She did not cry. She did not gasp. She said in a small, level voice, "How long until they come?" Silas and Ezra looked at each other across the table. It was a look that went back 38 years. It was the look that had passed between them the morning they had buried their parents together in one grave. It was the look that had passed between them the night before Ezra had boarded the troop train for Pennsylvania in the summer of '63. It was the look of 2 men who had understood without speech for their whole lives. "A week," Silas said. "Maybe 2. The pass is closing. They will try to come before the last snow shut them out." "All right," Clara said. "Then we have a week. Or 2. She stood up. She walked to the window. She looked out at the blue morning on the granite wall, and at the long white shoulder of Bitterroot falling away below them, and at the pines black under their load of snow. She turned around. "I am not a lamb, gentlemen," she said. "I did not come 2,000 miles to be sold in Denver. You will tell me what you need, and I will do it." Ezra Thornwood looked at her for a mind-made moment, and then he did something he had not done in 15 years. He smiled. Not the careful half-smile he used for his brother. A real smile, the one he had not used since before the peach orchard. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "you have a mind like a general. Napoleon would have liked you." "I read about Napoleon in Boston," Clara said. "He lost. He lost at the end," Ezra said. "But he won a great many winners first." Silas Thornwood stood up from the table. He walked over to Clara, and he did not touch her, but he stood very close. His amber eyes were steady on hers. "Miss Whitfield," he said quietly, "you are a Thornwood now. In this house on this mountain. Whatever comes up the trail, it is coming at a Thornwood. You understand?" "I understand," Clara said. "Good," Silas said. "Then we begin." In the week that followed, the cabin at Bitterroot became something that the cabin at Bitterroot had never been, a house preparing for war. Silas Thornwood did what Silas Thornwood did. He walked the perimeter. He ran tripwires of twine through the low pines, each one rigged to a small tin can filled with dry beans that would rattle at the smallest touch. He laid a line of rolling stones along the steep drop below the north face of the barn, each stone balanced on a spruce branch, the branch lashed to a trigger cord so that any man who came at the cabin from the blind side would bring a small avalanche down on his own head. He cleaned every rifle in the cabin. He loaded every pistol. Ezra Thornwood did what Ezra Thornwood did. He went into the shed and brought out heavy oak planks that their father had cut in 1855, and he cut them and nailed them to the insides of every window shutter so that any bullet coming in from outside would have to come through 2 inches of seasoned oak before it reached a person. He reinforced the back door with a crossbar of iron strapping. He sharpened every axe in the cabin, and he laid them in strategic places, one by the fireplace, one by the foot of the stairs, one on a shelf near the back door. Not for attack, for defense, because an axe in the hand of a man who has swung one for 30 years is a terrible thing. Clara Whitfield did what Clara Whitfield did. She sat at the kitchen table with a piece of charcoal and a square of brown paper, and she drew a map of the cabin and the yard and the slope down to the creek, and she marked every window, every door, every blind corner. She walked the rooms with her hickory cane counting paces until she knew the inside of the cabin, the way a ship captain knows the inside of his ship. She went into the pantry and she pulled down the dried henbane leaves that she had gathered in September and had hung to dry in the root cellar, and she crushed them into a jar with witch hazel and set the jar on the top shelf of the kitchen cupboard. It was, she explained quietly to Silas over supper, a sleeping draught, strong enough to drop a man within 3 minutes. She had learned it from Sister Margaret. If any man ever came into the cabin and asked for water, she said, and her voice was very flat, she would give him water. Silas Thornwood looked at her across the table. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Whitfield," he said. "I am a governess from Boston," she said. "I was taught to prepare." Ezra choked on his coffee. On the third day of preparation, Silas took Clara out to the hayfield behind the barn with his old Colt service revolver and a tin can. It was a cold, clear afternoon. The sun was low on the granite wall. Their breath made white clouds in front of their mouths. He loaded the Colt. He handed it to her. She was smaller than the gun. The handle of the Colt filled her palm. She looked up at him. Silas stepped around behind her. He did not touch her. He said in a low voice near her ear, feet apart, shoulders down, "You are not going to hit a target by being tall, Miss Whitfield. You are going to hit a target by being still. Hold it in both hands, right hand on the grip, left hand cupped under the right. Do not close your eyes when you pull the trigger. Breathe out and then pull." Clara did what he said. She raised the Colt. She sighted down the barrel. She breathed out. She pulled. The tin can 30 feet away on a fence post jumped into the air and bounced off into the snow. Silas Thornwood behind her was silent for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I do not know what they teach you in Boston, Miss Whitfield, but God help Mayor Grimes if he ever walks into this cabin." She lowered the Colt. She looked up over her shoulder at him. Her cornflower eyes had something new in them that afternoon, a small wild light, something that had been caged in the Ashford house and in the Boston boarding house, and that had finally in the cold air of a Montana field slipped free. "Teach me again," she said. On the fourth evening, while she was hanging a strip of wool across a leaking gap in the north window, Silas came in with a bundle of cut pine for the fire and stepped past her, and the back of his hand brushed the back of her hand as he passed. He did not mean to. He did not think he had. But he stopped in mid-stride just for half a second, and she felt the pause of him, and she did not turn around, because if she turned around, she thought her face would tell him everything. He walked on to the fire. She finished nailing the wool. Neither of them spoke of it, but her heart, which had not raced like that in her entire life, raced for an hour afterwards. And she sat by the fire later that night reading Whitman with hands that were not quite steady. On the fifth evening, Ezra sat with her at the kitchen table and showed her how to carve. He took a small piece of soft basswood and a small knife with a curved edge, and he put it in her hand and put his hand over hers and guided the first strokes. When she asked why he was teaching her this, he said simply, "Because you should know, Miss Whitfield, that there are Thornwood hands that only ever learn to kill a thing, and there are Thornwood hands that learn to make a thing, and a woman should know the difference." She looked at him across the table, and it was then that she understood the truth about Ezra Thornwood, that he loved her the way a brother loves a sister he has been given late in life, and that there was not one shred of anything else in it, and that he was glad of it. She had been given a brother. On the sixth night, she could not sleep. It was past midnight. The wind was low. The fire downstairs was banked. She had been dreaming of the Ashford house, of the back stairs, of the way Mr. Ashford's hand had closed on her arm, and she had come awake shaking her breath short, her good hand fisted in the quilt. She took her hickory cane. She went down the stairs as quietly as she could. Silas Thornwood was sitting in his father's chair by the fire. He had not been sleeping. Either he had a cup of cold coffee in his hand, and the fire had burned down to a red low bed of coals, and his amber eyes, when he turned them up at her, were tired and awake in the low light. Miss Whitfield, he said softly. I could not sleep, she said. He nodded. He did not ask why. He nodded to the bench by the fire and she sat. She sat close, not touching, but close. They did not speak for a long time. The fire moved. The cabin creaked. She said finally into the fire, Mr. Thornwood, may I tell you something that I have not told anyone? You may, he said. She told him about Mr. Ashford. She told him about the back stairs. She told him what had happened, which was not very much and had been enough. She told him about Mrs. Ashford in the parlor with the marble clock and the letter of reference that had never been given. She told him all of it without looking at him, because if she looked at him, she thought the telling would stop. When she was done, Silas Thornwood did not speak for a minute. Then he said very quietly in a voice she had not heard out of him before, Miss Whitfield, that man is alive in Boston. Is he not? He is, she said. I am a patient man, Silas said, and he looked into the fire. I have carried this mountain for 20 years. I can carry a thing a long time. But if I ever in this life come within one day's ride of that man, Miss Whitfield, I want you to know that he will not see another morning. I do not say that to make you afraid of me. I say it so that you will know in this cabin that you are safe, not because you are being guarded, because the thing that could hurt you is not going to live long enough to reach you. Do you hear me? I hear you, Clara said. Good, he said. She did not know afterwards which of them moved first. She found that her head was resting on his shoulder. That was all it was, her head on his shoulder. His arm did not come around her. He did not turn to her. He sat very still, the way a man sits when a wild bird has landed on his hand and he does not want to startle it away. He let her be. He watched the fire. He sat with her for 2 hours not moving, and she slept against him. And when dawn began to come gray in the east window, he did not wake her. He only sat there and watched the light come, and in the whole of his 38 years, it was the happiest he had ever been, and also the most frightened, because he knew now with an absolute certainty that if he lost her, he would not recover. The accident on the North Ridge came on the morning of December 7th. He had gone out alone. He had told her he would not go alone. He had lied in the gentle way a man lies because he wanted the great dead pine up on the North Ridge, and he wanted the 3 days of firewood it would give them, and he did not want her climbing in the snow with him on her bad leg, and he did not want Ezra climbing with his lung, so he said he was going to check traps, and he had taken the double-bitted axe in its leather sheath on his back, and he had gone up into the North Ridge alone in the blue cold of a Saturday morning. The dead pine had been standing, bark stripped by the wind for 4 winters. Silas Thornwood had felled 1,000 trees. He knew in the way a man knows the handle of his own axe where the cut should go. He made the notch on the downhill side deep and clean. He went around to the uphill side. He sank the axe for the final cut. The wind changed. It came just once, hard and wrong, out of the north, a gust that had not been there in the cold blue still of a minute before. The top of the great dead pine, which had been balanced to fall downhill, twisted. The trunk rolled. Instead of going out, it came back. Silas tried to step back. The snow was 3 feet deep. He did not step fast enough. The trunk of the dead pine came down on his right shin, and the snow and the weight of the falling wood drove his leg down onto a slab of granite under the snow that he had not seen. The bone went. The sound of it going was loud enough that a jay in a pine 200 yards off took flight. Silas Thornwood did not scream. He made one deep sound that was more like the sound a bull makes than the sound of a man, and then he went very quiet because a man who has lived 38 years with this mountain does not waste breath when his leg is shattered, and the sun is going to go down in 6 hours and it is 14 degrees. He tried to drag himself free. He could not. The trunk pinned him to the granite. It weighed roughly 1,800 pounds. The blood began to come through the leg of his trousers. He pressed his glove against it. It went on coming. 3 miles down the mountain at the cabin, Clara Whitfield stood at the kitchen window and felt something wrong move inside her chest, like a door closing in another room. Ezra was out at the far trap line. He had gone east. The sun was dropping fast, the last blue winter light tipping over toward the gold of a short day. Silas had been gone since just after dawn. He had said he would be back by mid-afternoon. It was nearly 3. She went to the porch. She lifted the old brass horn that Silas had hung on a peg by the door for emergencies, and she blew it 3 long blasts, the Thornwood distress call, and she listened, and the mountain was silent. She waited 1 minute. She blew it again. Silence. A third time, silence. Clara Whitfield stood on the porch of the cabin at Bitterroot Mountain on the afternoon of December 7th, 1878, and she made the decision that every Thornwood would later say had been the decision that saved their family. She went inside. She took her hickory cane. She put on Silas Thornwood's buffalo coat. She filled a canvas satchel with rolls of clean linen and the small bottle of rosemary oil and the paper of dry yarrow and a pint flask of willow bark tincture and the little brown bottle of golden seal. She took the Colt revolver. She took a lantern and a box of matches. She stepped off the porch into the snow. She did what they had told her in Silver Creek no cripple could ever do. She followed his tracks up the North Ridge alone. It took her 90 minutes to go a mile. The snow was up to her knees. The hickory cane sank. Her bad leg on every third step failed her, and she went down and she got back up. She did not stop. She did not cry. The sun slid lower on the west ridge. The shadows of the pines went long and blue, and she walked. She blew the brass horn every 5 minutes. The second time coming around a shoulder of the trail, she heard an answer. It was a sound like the sound a bull makes, very faint. Up to the right. She turned that way. She came up onto the flat of the North Ridge at 4 in the afternoon in the last low gold of the day, and she saw him. He was on his back in a red crater in the snow. The dead pine lay across his shin. His face was the color of old paper. His eyes were closed. The blood had soaked through 2 layers of wool and was dark at the edge of the packed snow around him. Clara dropped beside him. Silas, she said. Silas Thornwood. His eyes opened. He saw her. For 1 second, the amber of his eyes went wide and bright, and then it went small and hard. And he said in a voice that was almost not his voice, Clara, "Run! It is too heavy. Go find my brush. Leave me." She looked at the tree. She looked at the granite it was pinned on. She looked at him. She did not run. She had learned in Boston at the age of 19 from a book she had read in a library on a rainy afternoon that a woman who cannot lift a thing can still move a thing if she understands leverage. Archimedes, she had read, had said, "Give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I will move the world." She looked around the clearing. 10 feet away, the broken end of an oak branch as thick as her arm, as long as she was tall, had been cut loose by the falling pine. Clara Whitfield picked up the oak branch. She dragged it to the fallen pine. She wedged the thick end of the oak branch deep under the trunk of the pine, right beside the trapped leg. She found a small, rounded boulder the size of a loaf of bread, and she rolled it over and shoved it under the oak branch a foot back from where the branch met the trunk. She had built a lever. She climbed up onto the high end of the oak branch. She was 5'3". She weighed 105 pounds. The dead pine weighed 1,800. Silas, she said down to him steady, "When I tell you pull your leg free, do you hear me?" "I hear you," he said. She threw her body down onto the high end of the branch. All of her arms, her chest, her weight, her will. The oak branch bent. The stone under it creaked. The trunk of the dead pine lifted. 1 inch, then 2. "Now," Clara said. Silas Thornwood, fueled by the kind of adrenaline that only comes to a man whose woman has just lifted 1,800 pounds off of him, yanked his ruined leg out of the snow in one terrible heave, and he screamed, and she let the branch go, and the trunk of the pine slammed back down into the granite with a sound like a cannon, and the leg was clear. They were both for a moment silent. Then Clara was beside him in the snow, tearing her own petticoat into strips, packing the leg, binding it tight, pouring willow bark tincture straight into his mouth from the flask because she could not wait for the kettle to boil. She could not carry him. She weighed 105 pounds and he weighed 230. She cut two young saplings with his hatchet, which lay 2 feet from his hand. She lashed them together with the rope from his pack. She rolled him grunting onto the travois she had just built. She tied the drag lines around her own hips. She walked him down the mountain. 3 miles. 3 miles in the dark and with a lantern held in her teeth. Her hickory cane in one hand, the drag lines of a travois around her hips, and a 230-pound man on the travois behind her. Her bad leg failed her 8 times. She got back up 9. Ezra Thornwood, coming back along the creek trail after dusk, saw the small yellow smear of her lantern first. He did not understand at first what he was seeing. He began to run, and he could not run with the iron in his lung, and so he half ran and half walked, coughing now, without hiding it, and he came up onto her just below the last rise to the cabin. He saw his brother on the travois. He saw the woman in the buffalo coat dragging him. He did not speak. He did not have the breath. He took the drag lines out of her hands, and he took the weight onto his own ruined chest, and he dragged his brother the last quarter-mile to the porch with his sister, by marriage walking beside him, her cornflower eyes fixed straight ahead, her hickory cane striking the snow in the same steady rhythm it had struck all the way down the mountain, a rhythm that would be talked about in the country around Bitterroot for the next 40 years. The fever came at midnight. By midnight, the leg had doubled in size. The skin had gone shining and red and angry. Thin, dark lines of infection were beginning to crawl up the shin toward the knee. Silas Thornwood, who had not been sick a day since the winter he was 16, burned like a forge. He thrashed. He called the name of his mother. He called the name of his familiar. Twice in his delirium, he reached out a big trembling hand and said, "Clara, do not go." Clara Whitfield did not go. She built the fire up until the cabin was sweltering. She set the kettle and she boiled willow bark and yarrow and golden seal, and she made a mash of the yarrow, and she packed it into the wound and bound it fresh every 2 hours. She and Ezra worked together as a surgeon and a nurse work, without speaking, handing each other what the other needed before it was asked for. Ezra held his brother down when the pain came in the worst waves. Clara fed him the willow bark tincture, a drop at a time between his dry lips. She did not sleep. She did not leave the bed. She took from her carpet bag a small cloth doll that Sister Margaret had given her when she was 10, and she put it on the pillow beside him because her hands had other work to do. When Silas thrashed, she sang, softly, the lullaby her mother had sung to her before the carriage. 3 days, 3 days and 3 nights without sleep. On the dawn of the 4th day, the fever broke. Silas Thornwood opened his eyes and found himself in his own bed in his own cabin, in the watery gray light of a winter morning, and the iron pain in his leg had gone down to a dull, deep ache, and the shining, angry red had faded, and his head for the first time in 3 days was clear. There was a woman asleep in the chair beside his bed. Her head had fallen forward onto the edge of the mattress. Her honey hair had come out of its pins and lay across the blanket. Her small left hand was still curled open loose around his own large right hand. Silas Thornwood lay in his own bed and looked at Clara Whitfield for a long time. He looked at her until she stirred and her cornflower eyes opened, and she saw that he was awake and that his fever was gone and that he was looking at her. And then he said, in a voice roughened by 3 days of sickness, the thing he had promised his brother in the firelight 3 weeks before, that he would say before the spring. "Clara," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I might not be able to say it later when I am stronger and my mouth remembers how to be careful. So I am going to say it now while I am still weak enough to be honest." "Say it," she whispered. He held her small hand against his chest. "You dragged me down a mountain on a broken leg," he said. "You did not sleep for 3 nights. I have seen you do a thing that no man in Silver Creek would have said a woman of your size could do. But Clara, it is not because you did those things that I am about to say this. It is because of the afternoon you stood in the square of Silver Creek with a willow crutch and a lifted chin and would not look down. I loved you that afternoon, Clara Whitfield. I did not know how to say it. I did not know if I had the right. I am a plain rough man with a cabin and a mountain and no smooth words for a woman who reads Emily Dickinson. But I love you, Clara. I have loved you since September. I will love you until they put me in the ground. That is what I wanted to say. Clara Whitfield, who had not wept on Beacon Hill, and who had not wept in the square of Silver Creek, and who had not wept dragging a travois 3 miles in the dark, bent her head and pressed her forehead against the knuckles of Silas Thornwood's big right hand, and she wept for 30 seconds without sound, the way a woman weeps who has been waiting her whole life to be seen. Then she lifted her wet face. She put her other hand on his cheek. She said very quietly, Silas Thornwood, I have loved you since the afternoon you put your buffalo coat on my shoulders in the square of Silver Creek. Anywhere without you is nowhere. I am not going to Philadelphia. I am not going to Denver. I am not going back to Boston. I am going to stay with you on this mountain until you put me in the ground beside you. Do you hear me? I hear you, he said. And somewhere beyond the bedroom door, unseen by either of them, Ezra Thornwood, who had been sitting on the top step of the stairs with his harmonica in his hand and his scarred, gentle face turned toward the closed bedroom door, lifted the harmonica softly to his lips and played the first 5 notes of Shenandoah so quietly that only he could hear it as a kind of prayer of thanksgiving. Then he stood up and he wiped his face and he went downstairs to build up the fire, because winter always ends. And because outside the cabin, down the long switchback of the Widow's Trail, 40 miles below in the frozen valley of Silver Creek, lean wolfish man named Ezekiel Crane and 2 hired hands were at that very hour saddling horses in the stable behind the Golden Nugget Saloon. And Mayor Bartholomew Grimes was at the front window, watching them go, a glass of whiskey in one hand and a cruel small smile on his oily face, and the 3 men were about to begin the long, hard climb up the Widow's Trail. They believed they were coming to steal a bride. They did not yet know what was waiting for them at the top. Ezekiel Crane and his 2 hired men climbed for 2 days and a night. They climbed in the storm that came down off the pass on the evening of December 21st, because Crane was a wolfish man, and wolves hunt in weather that drives lesser animals into dens. They had 6 Winchester rifles between them, 4 pistols, 2 knives, 3 days of hardtack and bacon, and a canvas sack with a brass lock, which was to carry on the return trip the rolled body of Clara Whitfield wrapped in oilcloth if the wrapping of her alive did not prove convenient. Crane was a man who had learned in 1864 as a bounty hunter in Kansas that a live woman in a sack cried and drew attention, but a woman quietly put down with 1 clean pistol, shot and slung over a horse, drew no attention at all, and Mayor Bartholomew Grimes had paid for the second option if the first option failed. They came up the Widow's Trail in the dark of the 22nd. They were 2 miles short of the cabin when Crane's laid hand a man called Dobbs put his foot through a tripwire, and a tin can full of dry beans went off like a small, bright alarm in the pines. Inside the cabin, Clara Whitfield was sitting at the kitchen table with the Colt in her hand. The Colt had been in her hand, or within the reach of her hand, for 14 days. The henbane draft was on the cupboard shelf beside a glass pitcher of water that looked like any other pitcher of water in any other cabin. Silas Thornwood, who was still not standing well, was in the chair by the fire with a rifle across his knees. His leg was bound in a splint that Ezra had carved for him out of 2 straight pieces of ash. He could move. He could not run. He had made his peace with that 2 days ago when he had watched his wife load the Colt at the same table and had understood that the rough work of the Thornwood name for the first time in 30 years was going to be done by someone who stood 5'3". Ezra was at the back window with the second Winchester. The scar on his face was very pale in the lamplight. The bean can rattled again in the pines, then a second can further up the slope, then a third. 3 of them, Ezra said quietly, just like you said. Silas nodded. He did not move. Clara stood up. She crossed to the cupboard. She took down the glass pitcher. She poured out the water. She took down the jar with the henbane draft, and she poured that into the pitcher, and she filled it the rest of the way with clean water from the kettle, and she set the pitcher on the center of the kitchen table where any thirsty man walking into the cabin would see it first. Then she sat down again. She put the colt in her lap under her apron. "Mr. Thornwood," she said softly, "both of you, let me speak first. Let me see if I can end this without firing a shot." Silas Thornwood looked at his wife across the cabin. She had been his wife in spirit for 2 weeks now, and he had not asked her to be anything else yet. And he thought now that perhaps he should have, because a man ought to marry a woman before he watches her face down 3 killers in his kitchen. But there was no time. "Yes," he said. "All right, you speak first." Ezra eased back from the window. He set the Winchester across his knees. He took a position behind the door out of sight from the room. His scar was pale. His breath was steady. The old wound in his lung was quiet tonight because old wounds know in their own way when a night is not a night for coughing. The boots on the porch came 3 minutes later. A fist hammered on the heavy oak door. "Hello, the cabin," Ezekiel Crane called out in the friendly, bland voice of a man who had rehearsed his opening line. "We are travelers come up off the pass. The storm drove us off the trail. Could we trouble you for warmth and water?" "We have money to pay." Clara Whitfield looked at Silas. Silas nodded. Clara raised her voice. It came out level. "Travelers are welcome," she said. "I am alone with my husband who is laid up with a broken leg. Come in slow and leave your rifles on the porch. That's the law at Bitterroot." There was a pause. There was a muttered word between 3 men on a porch. Then the rifles clattered 1, 2, 3 onto the plank boards. The door opened. Ezekiel Crane came in first. He was taller than Clara had remembered from the stagecoach. He had yellow eyes and a mouth like a wire. Behind him came 2 hard men, one heavy and one lean, their hands loose at their belts where the pistols still were, because no Thornwood with a brain had ever believed 3 armed men had truly laid down all their weapons on a porch. Crane looked around the cabin. He saw the man in the chair with the splinted leg and the rifle across his knees. He saw the small woman at the table with the apron over her lap. He did not see Ezra Thornwood because Ezra Thornwood was no longer behind the door. Ezra Thornwood, in the 3 seconds it had taken Crane to enter, had moved silent across the kitchen and was now standing behind the curtain of the pantry doorway with the Winchester at his shoulder and a clear line of fire at the back of every head that came through that door. Crane saw the pitcher of water on the table. "I would trouble you for a drink, ma'am," he said in that same bland voice. The pass was dry. "Of course," Claire said. She stood. She did not reach for the Colt. She walked to the cupboard and took down 3 tin cups. She set them on the table. She poured water from the pitcher into each cup. She handed one to Crane. She handed one to the heavy man. She handed one to the lean man. She did not pour one for herself. Crane drank. He drained the cup. The heavy man drank. The lean man drank. Clara stepped back 2 paces to the edge of the stove. Her hand went down beneath her apron and came up again holding the Colt. The lean man saw it first. He was 2 seconds too slow. He reached for the pistol at his belt, and his arm would not quite obey him because something cold and strange had just begun to move up his spine. Crane blinked. He tried to focus. His eyes had already begun to drift. The heavy man, whose name was Dobbs, opened his mouth to shout, and nothing came out but a long, slow exhalation, and then his knees folded under him, and he went down on the kitchen floor with a sound like a sack of grain hitting boards. Crane, furious understanding, now yanked at the pistol at his belt. He got it halfway out. He could not close his hand on the trigger. He was looking at Clara Whitfield with yellow eyes that had gone first wide and then small, and he said in a voice that was not quite a voice, "You poisoned us. I gave you water." Clara said quietly, "Silas." Silas Thornwood had lifted the rifle across his knees. He did not need to fire it. He only needed to point it. The lean man, seeing the black mouth of the rifle and feeling his own legs go soft beneath him, sagged against the door frame and slid to his knees. Ezekiel Crane, who had tried in the last 3 seconds of consciousness to turn toward the door, turned instead in a slow, gentle falling arc, and he hit the floorboards with his cheek, and his yellow eyes closed and his breath went quiet. 3 men were down in a Thornwood kitchen. None of them was dead. Ezra stepped out from behind the pantry curtain. He let out the breath he had been holding. He lowered the Winchester. "Well," he said. Clara Whitfield lowered the Colt. She set it on the table. Her hand began, now that the work was done, to shake a little. Silas saw it shaking. Silas did not comment. He reached out with his big right hand and closed his fingers very gently around her small hand and held it until it stopped shaking, and then he let her go. "Tie them," he said to Ezra, "back to back, in the barn under the hayloft trap. I want them alive and talking by morning." Ezra tied them. He tied them the way an old soldier ties prisoners, thorough and unkind, with the cabin's good hemp rope. He dragged Dobbs out first because Dobbs was the heaviest, and he came back for Crane next because Crane was the most dangerous, and he came back for the lean man last because the lean man was beginning to stir. By the time the 3 of them were arranged in the barn, gagged and lashed to the center post under the hayloft trap, a gray dawn was beginning to show in the east window of the cabin. Ezekiel Crane sang like a little bird at first light. He sang because the henbane draft had left him with a headache like a railroad spike and a mouth like the inside of a boot, and because he was a man who had been paid in advance and did not see why he should die in a Thornwood barn for a mayor who had already received his fee. He sang because Ezra Thornwood stood in front of him with a skinning knife in his big calloused hand and did not cut him and did not threaten him and only looked at him with the quiet, scarred patience of a man who had seen worse things in Pennsylvania in July of '63, and Crane had enough sense left in his yellow eyes to understand that quiet patience. He gave them Grimes. He gave them Mrs. Prudence Whitmore. He gave them the $40 price in Denver. He gave them the closed coach that had been waiting 2 blocks from the Golden Nugget, and he gave them the name of the man who ran the quiet house on Arapahoe Street, and he gave them because he had kept it for his own insurance, a folded oilcloth packet from the inner pocket of his black coat. Ezra brought the packet into the cabin. Clara sat at the kitchen table. She opened the packet. Inside was a letter unopened, addressed in a steady woman's hand to Miss Clara Whitfield, care of the Sisters of St. Cecilia, Back Bay, Boston. The letter was 10 months old. The wax seal was still whole. Beside the letter was a train ticket, first class Boston to Philadelphia, dated June of 1878. Beside the train ticket was a bank draft drawn on the Philadelphia National Bank for $500. Clara Whitfield picked up the letter. She looked at the handwriting. She did not know the handwriting. She broke the seal. She read. She read it twice. She set the letter down on the table very carefully, the way a woman sets down a thing that might break, and she put both her hands flat on the table, and she looked at Silas Thornwood for a long time without speaking. Then she told them. The letter was from a woman named Cornelia Whitfield Blackstone. She was the younger sister of Clara's dead mother. She was 62 years old. She was a childless widow in Philadelphia, the mother of nothing, the wife of a man 10 years in the grave, and she had been searching for her sister's child through every orphanage and charity list in the eastern states for 10 years. She had written finally in the spring of '78 to the Sisters of St. Cecilia because Sister Margaret had corresponded with her once long ago about a certain limping child. The Sisters of St. Cecilia had forwarded the letter through the Boston post office to the last known address of Clara Whitfield, which had been a boarding house on the harbor side. The letter had been put on the St. Louis train. It had been put on the stage west. It had crossed the last high pass at Silver Creek, where it had been opened, read, and then kept by a postmaster named Bartholomew Grimes, who had been considering as his second line of profit whether there might be a reward out of Philadelphia for returning a lost heiress alive. Cornelia Whitfield Blackstone, the letter said, had left her entire estate to her niece. She had enclosed the fare. She had enclosed a bank draft for immediate expenses. She begged Clara to come without delay to Philadelphia, where a home and a family and a piano and a garden and a long, quiet, good life were waiting for her. Clara finished telling them. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood. Silas Thornwood, who was in the chair by the fire with his splinted leg up on a pine stool, looked at his wife, and his amber eyes were very quiet. "If you want Philadelphia, Clara," he said, "I will ride you down to the stage myself, on my good leg and on my bad one. I will put you on it. I will not hold you. I am a mountain man. I have a cabin and 40 miles of snow. A woman who reads Emily Dickinson and who has an aunt and a piano and a garden waiting should not be asked to live where the wind eats the chinking in the walls every spring. You were brought here by a trap. You have been in this cabin a free woman only for one morning. I will not be the trap that keeps you after the other trap has sprung." Clara Whitfield looked at Silas Thornwood. She picked up the letter from her aunt. She folded it once. She folded it twice. She did not tear it. She laid it folded on the center of the kitchen table. Then she spoke. "Silas," she said, "my whole life I have been sent places. I was sent to an orphanage. I was sent to a governess post. I was sent to Boston boarding houses and to stagecoaches and to Silver Creek and to Denver, which I did not reach, because the first man who ever asked me where I wanted to go was the man who put his buffalo coat on my shoulders in a muddy square. And when he asked me, I told him, 'I told you in this cabin on the morning your fever broke. Anywhere without you is nowhere. I told you I was going to stay on this mountain until you put me in the ground beside you. I have not changed my mind between that morning and this one. I will write to my Aunt Cornelia. I will invite her with love to come west and visit her niece at Bitterroot. I will invite her to come every summer for as long as her health allows it, and I will make her welcome at this table, and I will let her help me teach my children their letters and their French. But I am not going to Philadelphia. I am home. I have come home. And you, Silas Thornwood, are going to stop trying to send me away." Silas Thornwood, who had been a man who carried weight for 20 years, sat in the chair by the fire and looked at his wife, and the weight for the first time in 30 years did not feel like it was going to break him. "All right," he said quietly. "All right," Clara said. Ezra Thornwood, leaning in the doorway with his harmonica in his hand, grinned a small, crooked grin. He said, "Well, I suppose we ride down the mountain then." It was 6 days before the Thornwood brothers, Clara Whitfield, Ezekiel Crane, and 2 hired men bound and tied in a freight sled descended the Widow's Trail to Silver Creek. By the time the procession came down Main Street at noon on December 29th of 1878, the entire population of the town was on the porches again, and this time no one was laughing. U.S. Marshal Patrick O'Brien had come in that morning from Helena by hard riding in answer to a telegram Ezra had sent by way of a trusted freighter 4 days earlier. Marshal O'Brien was a tall, thin Irishman with a white mustache and a reputation for hanging men who sold women, and he was by 1 in the afternoon standing on the porch of the Golden Nugget Saloon with Ezekiel Crane standing beside him in chains and singing a second verse to everyone who would listen. And Mayor Bartholomew Grimes was inside the Nugget with 2 deputies and a face the color of old paper. Mrs. Prudence Whitmore tried to leave town in a closed carriage at 2 o'clock. She was stopped at the edge of Silver Creek by 2 deputies on horseback and was brought back to the town jail in her own silk traveling cloak, which she would not be wearing again. By sundown of December 29th, Mayor Bartholomew Grimes, Mrs. Prudence Whitmore, Ezekiel Crane Dobbs, and the lean man whose name turned out to be Harlan Skiff were all in the Silver Creek town jail, and the news of what had been done at Bitterroot had moved through the town like a fire through dry grass. Clara Whitfield that afternoon walked across the muddy square of Silver Creek on her hickory cane with Silas Thornwood on one side of her on a crutch Ezra had carved him, and Ezra Thornwood on the other side of her with his harmonica silent at his chest. She walked slowly. She did not hurry. She crossed the exact spot where 3 months before, a man had laughed at her. She did not look at that spot. She looked straight ahead. At the dry goods store, she bought linen thread sugar coffee, a bolt of pale blue muslin, a bag of apple seed for a spring garden she intended to plant, and a copy of Little Women by Miss Louisa May Alcott, which she had been wanting to read for 2 years. As she came out with her packages, a small old woman in a faded bonnet was waiting at the bottom of the steps. Her name was Mrs. Meredith. She was the oldest woman in Silver Creek. She had on the day of the stage stood on the porch of the Nugget and laughed and had not slept right for a week afterward. Mrs. Meredith took Clara's gloved hand. She did not try to kneel. Her old knees would not have allowed it. Mrs. Thornwood, she said, I was in the square in September. I laughed. I am old and I am ashamed and I ask your pardon, girl. I will never laugh at another woman in this town again for as long as I live. Clara Whitfield looked down at the old woman, and her cornflower eyes were gentle, and she pressed the old woman's hand once and let it go. Mrs. Meredith, she said, I do not need your kneeling. I need you to raise the next girl in this town the way Sister Margaret raised me. That is all I need. That is all anyone ever needed from this town. And she walked on with her brothers on either side of her, and the people of Silver Creek parted for her as they had parted for the Thornwood brothers 3 months before, and no one, not one man, not one woman laughed. They were married on the 11th of May, 1879, under the great oak that stood in the yard of the cabin at Bitterroot. The oak had been planted by Josiah Thornwood in 1840 on the morning his twin sons had been born, and in 39 years it had grown to a height of 60 feet, and its shade in May was broad and green. Clara's Aunt Cornelia had come out from Philadelphia on the spring stage and was sitting in a chair under the oak with a shawl over her shoulders, weeping steadily and happily into a lace handkerchief. The preacher was a Reverend Thaddeus Wren, who had ridden 3 days from Helena with a leather-bound book and a tin of whiskey in his saddlebag. Ezra Thornwood stood up as his brother's witness, a woman named Hannah Morrison, who had arrived in Silver Creek in the spring as the new schoolmistress and who had befriended Clara in the weeks since the thaw in a way that would soon become something else for Ezra, stood up as the witness for the bride. The cabin was full of wildflowers that Clara had been gathering in a basket since the snow first went. There was lavender on the mantel. There were mountain violets laid along the sill of every window. Silas Thornwood, who had never been one for long speeches, stood under the oak in his father's coat and his father's boots and the only clean white shirt he owned, and he spoke his vow in a voice that the people under the tree would remember for the rest of their lives. Clara Whitfield, he said, you came to the square of Silver Creek with a willow crutch and a lifted chin, and you would not look down. You came up my mountain in the dark on a bad leg, and you pulled an 1,800-pound tree off me with your own 2 hands. You nursed my fever. You made this cabin smell of lavender for the first time in 20 years. You will be my wife under the law of God and under the law of Bitterroot. I will keep you through every winter that is coming and through every spring that comes after it. I will fail you in small ways because I am a plain man, but I will not fail you in the large ones. And when the last winter comes for me, Clara, I will go into it with your name on my mouth. That is my word. That is my vow. Clara Whitfield, in a simple white dress, she had sewn herself from the pale blue muslin of Silver Creek, and a bolt of lace her aunt had brought from Philadelphia, looked up at the big amber-eyed mountain man, who had been her husband in every way but the law for 8 months, and she spoke her vow. Silas Thornwood, she said, I have loved you since you put your buffalo coat on my shoulders in a muddy square, and I will love you until my last breath. You have shown me, and Ezra has shown me, what the law at Bitterroot is. The law at Bitterroot is that we do not judge by limps and scars. The law at Bitterroot is that we judge by the heart. I will live under that law with you for as long as God allows me. And when the last winter comes for one of us, I want you to remember that winter always ends, Silas. Even that one. Winter always ends. They kissed under the oak. The kiss was not long. It was enough. Aunt Cornelia cried harder. Ezra put the harmonica to his lips and played simple gifts, and the wildflowers turned in the small breeze, and the great granite wall behind the cabin glowed pale gold in the late afternoon light. They were married. The years that followed the wedding at the oak were the long good years, and they passed in the rhythm that long good years have on a mountain marked not by dates, but by weather and planting and births and quiet suppers, by a fire. In the summer of '79, Clara Whitfield Thornwood restored the herb garden of Ruth Thornwood along the south wall of the cabin. Lavender, rosemary, wild sage, mountain violets. The little garden in one season grew into a half-acre, and by late summer, women were riding up the widow's trail from as far as Helena to buy poultices and tinctures from the limping woman at Bitterroot. Clara did not charge them in cash if they could not pay. She charged them in eggs, in bread, in lengths of cloth, in promises to come back when there was more. She became known across 2 counties as the Bitterroot Healer, and by the winter of '79, her name was spoken in Silver Creek with the kind of respect the town had once refused her. In the spring of '80, Ezra Thornwood married the schoolmistress Hannah Morrison in a second wedding under the same oak, and they built a cabin of their own a mile north along the creek. The iron in his lung after 2 winters of Clara's willow bark and mullein did not trouble him so often. His harmonica had a wife to play to now, and it played different songs. In February of '81, and in the small bedroom that had been Ruth Thornwood's, Clara Whitfield Charnwood and brought a daughter into the world. She named the daughter Margaret for the crooked old nun in the Back Bay, who had told a limping child long ago, "You will not be broken here, girl." Silas Thornwood, who had buried his parents at 18 and his own boyhood at the same graveside, took his newborn daughter in both of his big calloused hands on the dawn after her birth. And he cried for the first time since he had dug the grave in '58, and he did not try to hide it, and Ezra played Shenandoah very softly under the window until the baby slept. In the summer of '83, a son was born to Silas and Clara Thornwood, and he was named James for Silas Thornwood's father. 2 years later, Ezra and Hannah had their own first child, a boy they named Josiah Jr., and the 2 mothers and the 2 fathers and the 2 first cousins sat around the Bitterroot supper table at Thanksgiving of '85 and watched the fire, and Silas Thornwood looked down the table at all the people he had made and had kept, and he did not say anything because he had no need. In the autumn of '86, Clara gave birth to her second daughter, and they named her Rose because the first thing her fingers closed around laid in her mother's arms was a dried mountain rose from the wall above the bed. In the summer of '89, Montana was admitted to the Union as a state. The Thornwood children ran through the herb garden, waving flags they had made out of scrap cloth, and Silas sat on the porch of the cabin and looked down the switchback of the widow's trail into a country that was no longer a territory, and he nodded at it once, and he went back inside for supper. In the summer of '90, a last son was born, and they named him William for no reason, except that Clara had always liked the name. In the winter of '92, a letter came up the pass from Philadelphia. Aunt Cornelia Whitfield Blackstone had died quietly in her sleep on the 12th of January. She had come out to Bitterroot every summer for 12 years, and she had taught the older Thornwood children to play the small pieces of Mozart and to curtsy without fear, and she had left in her will the entire Whitfield estate some $52,000 in stocks and real property to her niece. Clara Whitfield Thornwood read the will standing in the snow on the cabin porch with the letter in her hand. She wept for 1 minute into the back of her glove. Then she folded the will and took it inside and set it on the mantel under the daguerreotype of Josiah and Ruth Thornwood. She used the Whitfield money for one thing only. In the spring of '93, with Silas beside her and Ezra riding point, she went down to Helena, and she bought 3 acres of land on the north side of town, and she built with the best carpenter in the capital a long, low house of whole oak logs and a working herb garden and a small library and a schoolhouse wing, and she called it the Whitfield Thornwood Home for Children. She staffed it with 5 women and a doctor from the Sisters of St. Cecilia and 2 retired school teachers from Chicago. She set down in the founding charter one rule above all others, and she had Ezra carve that rule into the lintel of the front door where any arriving orphan could read it from the bottom step. It said, "We do not judge scars or limps here. We judge by the heart." The years rolled on. In the summer of '96, Margaret Thornwood, 15 years old with her mother's cornflower blue eyes and her father's steady gaze, was accepted to the Blackstone School for Young Women in Philadelphia. She rode down to Helena with her Aunt Hannah on the late summer stage, and she wept at the station, and her mother wept on the platform. And Silas Thornwood, who was 56 years old now, and silvering at the temples, put his hand on his wife's shoulder and said softly in her ear, "Winter always ends, Clara. She will come back." And she did. Margaret Thornwood came back in 1904 as a young doctor, one of the first women in the state of Montana to carry a medical degree, and she opened her practice in Silver Creek and healed that town through the influenza winter of 1905, like a daughter paying back a debt her mother had never asked her to carry. James Thornwood took over the running of the ranch at Bitterroot in '99 at 16. He had his father's hands. He had his mother's mind. He married a rancher's daughter from the valley in 1903. Rose Thornwood became a schoolmistress in Silver Creek in 1904. William Thornwood, the youngest, was already in his second year at the University of Montana with a plan to bring the telegraph line up the Widow's Trail when he finished his degree. Ezra and Hannah Thornwood's children, Josiah Jr. and Elizabeth and Thomas, grew up with their cousins, and they all married well and lived near. The great old oak stood and stood. In the summer of 1908, on an afternoon in July, Clara Whitfield Thornwood stood on the porch of the cabin at Bitterroot Mountain. She was 53 years old. She was mostly silver now, with a few strands of the honey color still in her hair at the temples. She walked after 30 years of a hickory cane and a leather brace Ezra had made her with a firmer step than she had walked in all her long life. She wore a blue dress. She wore a small cameo at her throat. The porch had been rebuilt twice. The cabin had been added onto 3 times. There was a wing for the children who came home with their own children. There was a long table under the great oak for summer suppers. There were roses on the south wall and lavender along the path. Silas Thornwood came out onto the porch behind her. He was 68 years old. His beard was white. He still walked every morning at dawn up to the spring house on a leg that had set crooked in the winter of '78, and that still ached when the weather turned. He moved slower than he had once moved. He did not move less. He carried 2 tin cups of coffee. He handed one to his wife. He sat down beside her on the bench he had built her in 1880. Down in the south meadow, 7 grandchildren were chasing each other through a field of mountain violets. The oldest was 12. The youngest was 3. They belonged to the older Thornwood children, and they were all on the mountain this July because Ezra and Hannah were hosting the Thornwood Summer Gathering at their cabin a mile north, and all the families had come. Silas sipped his coffee. "Clara," he said. She said. "Do you ever regret it," he said, "choosing this instead of Philadelphia?" Clara Whitfield Thornwood looked at her husband of 30 years. She looked at the deep line between his eyebrows and the old scar on the back of his right hand and the white hair curling at his collar. "Silas Thornwood," she said, "in Boston they called me useless. In Silver Creek they called me a cripple. In Philadelphia they would have called me a lady. But on this mountain you called me your wife. Your brother called me sister. My children call me mother. My grandchildren call me grandmother. I found my place. I do not regret a single winter of it. Not one." He took her small hand in his big one. Down in the meadow the grandchildren ran and laughed. "Winter always ends," Silas Thornwood said quietly. "Yes, Clara Whitfield," Thornwood said. "Yes, it does. And so does the waiting for it to end. That ends too. That is what nobody ever told me in Boston. Eventually the waiting ends." They sat there a long time without speaking. On the mantel inside the cabin, beneath the old daguerreotype of Josiah and Ruth Thornwood, Clara had years ago set a second small-frame photograph. It was a photograph of a young woman with pale hair and very steady eyes taken in a traveling studio on Tremont Street in the spring of '77. Beside it was a willow crutch broken along the grain. Beside the willow crutch was a hickory cane with a small violet carved into the handle. The sun went down slow behind the granite wall. The grandchildren came up the path. Clara Whitfield stood up from the bench and took her husband's arm and walked into the house she had come to on a September evening 30 years before, and the cabin at Bitterroot Mountain filled once again with the voices of the people they had made and the people they had kept and the people who had come home. The fire was built up, always the rate blew up. Somewhere on the mountain, an owl called twice and stopped. And the law at Bitterroot, which said that no one in that house was to be judged by scars or by limps, but only by the heart, went on in that house, as it had gone on for 30 years, and as it would go on for as long as there were thornwoods on the mountain to remember it, which it turned out was a very long time indeed.